Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another Leadership Launchpad Pick and Mix podcast. And today, as you will already have seen, we have in my opinion, the great Rob Coe here to help us unpick some stuff about himself, about some launchpads, and to learn more about him as a person and what sits behind all of the great stuff that we know we've interacted with him. So as usual, I'll just get the slides up and running, and then we will get started. Here we go. So, I was just talking to Rob actually offline about our mutual love of travelling to Italy. I've just literally came back this morning, which was lovely, although we packed a lot in, and so it was 10 days with 6 places, lots of dragging kids around trains and stuff like that. Anyway, here we go. So as you know, if you haven't connected with Rob, we'll learn a bit more about his role and stuff, but his main role is with an incredible organisation called Evidence-Based Education. So let's get cracking on this and learn a bit more about this role that you've got, Rob. So tell us a bit more about your role as the Director of Research and Development at EBE.
Okay, well, EBE is a small startup, although it's getting bigger now. I think we've got about 20 or over 20 staff now. When I joined, I think it was about half that. And it was actually set up by Stuart Kime and Jack Devison. Stuart was one of my PhD students in the day. Right. And so we knew each other. Well, I'd already knew him a bit. He was a deputy head and a teacher in local schools around Durham.
Yeah.
And I had been working in the university, Durham University, trying to bridge that gap between research and practice, and finding it quite difficult to do in a university context, because obviously the research is well supported, but the kinds of things that you need to do to actually create tools, products, support that works in school is actually a lot harder. And so I was kind of thinking maybe it's time for a change, and the opportunity came up, and so I was able to move across. I actually was jointly working for EBE and the Education Endowment Foundation at that time. In fact, I was doing more for EEF, in another great organisation, and then over time it's gradually shifted a bit more. So I still do work for EEF, but it's a smaller number of hours generally. Most weeks it's not many, and most of my time is now on EBE. So lots of E's.
Stuff, that's great, isn't it? I think you've started to answer this, I suppose. This why the move, but was it to bridge that gap between theory and practice?
Well, it's a mixture, I suppose, like any move, isn't it? I think things at Durham had gone a little bit sour for me in a few different ways. The unit that I was as the director of CHEM, the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, and that was being sold off by Durham, and that was not a very pleasant process for me, certainly.
No.
So it was a good reason, good time to go, I guess. I'd been an academic for 20 years nearly, which is a good long stretch of time, and I had done a lot of the things that I wanted to do. I mean, there's a lot more you can do, obviously, and I enjoyed the academic life, but I think in my research I've always tried to ground it in school practice. I was a teacher before that, so I kind of know a bit about how schools work, or a little bit about that. And it always seems to me that research should have benefit for practitioners. If if it doesn't, then I mean, not all research does, certainly not all directly does. I understand that there's a place for blue sky work and that kind of thing, but the work that I was mostly interested in, the work that got me excited and that I really wanted to spend time and energy on, was more practical, more applied. And the problem is, I think a lot of people, when they think about the interaction between research and practice, they'll use terms like research use, with the implication that the research is done in the university or in the research organisations, and then it's somehow sort of pushed out, and then it's absorbed by people in schools. And I think if I ever thought that, I certainly didn't think it for a long time. I don't think that's how it works. I think we
No.
need more of a kind of co-production
That's
type
interesting.
model. And I also think that what we're talking about is changing people's behaviour,
Yeah.
and primarily about learning, actually. So again, I think different ways of thinking about, well, how does research make a difference to practice, to how
Yeah.
schools run? And I think it's not, it's not about saying, well, here's a thing that works, get off you go and do this thing. Research says, oh, right, pay attention to cognitive load, or, use this type of questioning, or things like that. We find research studies say this is a good way to do it, and then we say to teachers, right, off you go and do this thing.
Yeah.
And I think what we know, if we research whether that works or not, is that that doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And I think partly, well, there's a whole load of reasons, but partly because it's not really, it's less like kind of stopping smoking or losing weight or those kind of behavioural changes.
Right.
It's more like becoming, a chess grandmaster or a virtuoso pianist or those kinds of things. It's more of a learning challenge than a behaviour change challenge, I think. I mean, it is a bit of both.
Sure.
And obviously to learn, if I want to become a concert pianist, one of the main things I have to do is spend a lot of time practicing.
Yeah.
And so that is a behaviour change. But fundamentally, the change I want to see is learning rather than, okay, I know I just need to eat differently and exercise more and, then it'll happen. And those are things I know how to do. I don't need to learn how to eat differently. Well, not really. That's not really the barrier. It's about the habit change. And changing teaching practice, classroom practice, is a bit that.
Yeah.
But it's also a lot about, I think it's a lot about learning. So, we talk a lot about expertise as being the key determinant, just like the expertise of a concert pianist or the expertise of a chess grandmaster or whatever.
Yeah.
The expertise of a classroom teacher or the expertise of a school leader.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? And I think that's something that, you have to have that mindset of this is a lifetime pursuit, isn't it? This is not something that is going to be done. I won't be ever done as a teacher or the final article, because of the fact that it's such a dynamic working environment with so many different kind of factors. And I suppose we shouldn't get into this too much, but there is a slight worry of mine that we are starting to see it a bit transactional, and that people are. Sometimes I hear, people I work with, they talk about, have I done enough PD? Have I done my PD? This idea of done. Have I done it?
Yeah.
Or did it? And it's like, well, that's kind of not really the atmosphere, the ethos. So how does a typical week work or look for you then?
Working week? Well, a lot of it is me sat here on this chair at home in my office, doing stuff, and a lot of stuff. Some of that's about analysis, data analysis. So one of the things we've done with the Great Teaching Toolkit, which is our main support program for teachers and schools to learn to get better, is things like surveys, student surveys. We've got lots of data. I've been spending this week, for example, doing analysis of what we've learned so far from more than 100,000 student surveys, about 120, I think, 120,000 student surveys, analysing the what that tells us about those teachers, those classrooms, and those teachers are all interacting with a professional development platform. So again, we can see what have they done before and after they've done these surveys and so on. They've engaged in learning courses, they've engaged with different kinds of resources, they've recorded their goals for their own professional development, they've collaborated with others, all of those things. And to a greater or lesser extent, we've captured those things because they do it through the platform, so we can see what's happening, what are they doing, how does that affect their students' perception of what's happening in their classrooms. So that's analysis.
That's
I guess
really
is a big part of that. But lots of other things, writing of different kinds, reading stuff, obviously. Lots of planning and meetings and interacting with other colleagues. Lots of also going out into schools and talking to people, either giving talks and workshops and things like that, or just chatting with teachers and school leaders about what they're trying to do, what the barriers are, how we can help them overcome that. We also work collaboratively with different organisations. So we've got a big project on with the National Institute of Teaching, for example. Okay. Again, that's mostly a data analysis thing. So that's quite an interesting, another research project.
That sounds great. And you're definitely kind of walking the walk, aren't you, in terms of learning yourself? It seems like what you're doing all day long is just, And we're going to talk a little bit later about one of the launch pads you picked, but this is old now, isn't it? The idea of knowledge is power, or, when we know better, we can, hopefully.
Yeah, I think you never, it's a sort of mindset, isn't it, about wanting to learn more stuff. Wanting to get better at things, I suppose, is part of it, but also just maybe enjoying the process of learning. Here's a thing I don't know how to do. Right, amazing. Well, let me see if I can work it out. Let me see if, maybe find a course or find something to read or just have a go. And you can do that all the time. Yesterday I was trying to learn a new statistical analysis process that I'd never done before, and I thought might be useful, and playing around and just trying to work it out and see if I can get it to work. So that was a learning day. It wasn't a productive day in terms of I could say, well, here's something I've created today, or here's a piece of work I've completed. It was more of a kind of messy day where I'm just trying to learn how to do something.
Well, that's really interesting that you use that word messy, because that was on my mind as you were talking then about how, again, if you're gonna lean into this idea that we're never fixed and we should always be learning, you also need to lean into this idea that it's not going to be comfortable all the time, and a lot of times clarity is on the other side of confusion and stuff like that. And one of the things that I would imagine most people have engaged with by now, but the first time that I think I engaged with your work was an uncomfortable situation, which I think we've joked about lots of times, in that when I tripped over the kind of poor proxies for learning, it was quite uncomfortable because I think it described my teaching at the time, and I thought, wow, oh geez, and I as I read more, I understood that you weren't suggesting these were things that aren't important. They're just that potentially not the right lenses or proxies to use. But so that was really interesting. And then of course, another thing that I think where I've engaged with your work, the EBE work, really is that student survey stuff. And again, I was a little bit skeptical before I did it because I guess I was unsure about the validity maybe of the comments from my students. I think I quickly got a sense that I wasn't getting the truth from them, but why wouldn't I want more information? Why wouldn't I want a different perspective? And I found it really, really useful, again, although slightly uncomfortable, to hear what my students thought about me. So fascinating stuff.
I think it is uncomfortable. I think any kind of feedback, actually, when you've been in an environment where you're not getting that kind of feedback, and I would argue where you're not really getting good feedback either, and I think that's basically the origin of the poor proxies, that you're a teacher, you're in a classroom, you can see how it's going in lots of ways with those proxies. You can see whether kids are busy, you can see whether they're behaving, you can see whether they're producing, filling a page with work or whatever. But those are all not very good indicators of whether they're in fact learning stuff. They're good things, you're right. It's not that we don't want to see them, it's just that we shouldn't trust them as being a really reliable source of feedback about how well we're doing. And if we do trust them too much, then we can get pulled into busy work just to keep them doing stuff, or activities that are more fun than they are really thinking hard. Various things like that. That it's fine to do that a bit, but if you do it all the time, or if you do it thinking that that's learning, then you're in trouble, and you're not going to get as much learning as if you do the things that are really about learning.
Yeah.
So I think getting feedback is I mean, I'd say that's the kind of secret sauce in the whole of the Great Teaching Toolkit for me, or the power that's the unique element that distinguishes it from other things, is this emphasis on feedback and how to help people just see their own practice a bit more sharply. And you're right, students have a particular perspective. You ask them, they may like certain things, they may not like certain things, they may like you or not like you. I mean, those are not the questions we ask, as you know.
No.
They're much more specific about practice in the classroom and things that happen. Some of it's about their feelings and perceptions about it, but only where it's relevant to something that we know or that the best research says is likely to make a difference to how much they learn. And you have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because it's just their perspective.
Sure.
And also, that if you did a survey another day or with another class you teach, it would be quite different. Or even, just if different kids were there on the day who did it. So it's not the ultimate truth about everything, your whole identity as a teacher, but it is a useful insight. And most people are a bit reluctant to do it because it feels a bit scary, and you just think, I don't need that in my life. When they then do it, they almost always, in my experience, learn something that is quite insightful that they didn't realise. They kind of knew it. It's not a huge surprise to them that the students say this, but on the other hand, they certainly hadn't thought about it in quite the same way as they did after getting that insight. So I think a really powerful thing. I'd say the same about video. I think if you've ever captured video, just watched video of yourself. People use video sometimes to watch other people as great examples, and that can be good. But to watch yourself teaching, again, is excruciating. You look at yourself and you think, oh, I've put on a few pounds, or whatever it might be. My hair's looking a bit messy. Some people think that.
For some people.
But if you can get beyond that, or my voice, that's the other thing. People think, do I really sound like that? And think about what you're doing and the things that you could change. Again, almost everyone can come up with a quite a simple, actionable change that they could make that would improve their practice. And so I'm all about saying, well, just choose one thing, make that change, make sure you really embed that change. So it's not enough just to watch a video once and think, oh, well, it would be helpful if I didn't say as much, or wave my hands around, or whatever it might be. Those are quite trivial things.
Sure.
And then probably never do it again, and probably forget all about it. And if you were to come back in 6 months and do another video, you'd find you're doing it just as much because you've forgotten to focus on it. So it hasn't really changed. It hasn't become a permanent fixture.
Brilliant. Well, again, not to derail the whole podcast by talking about this, but hey, it's fascinating stuff. The last thing
I'm not sticking to the script here. Sorry.
The last thing I wanted to say really about that, another thing that was a surprise to me when I did the EBE student kind of questionnaire stuff, was the strengthening of the relationships between me and my students. Because they felt like I wanted to hear their voice. That was massive for me. Really interesting. Okay. Well,
it's just so complicated, isn't it? Teaching it must be one of the most complicated things that human beings have ever tried to do. And when you're trying to learn complicated things, getting good feedback is really, really important, because you need to know whether what you're doing is succeeding. So any way that we can help to amplify that, I think, is a powerful enhancer of professional learning.
Well, for those that are new to the podcast, we have a sort of set structure, I suppose, and Rob's done some choices beforehand around questions he wants to answer, launch pads he wants to talk about, and some ignition points from his life that have made a big difference. And so the first one really is this fast friends question. And tell us a bit about this, Rob. You chose, for what in your life do you feel most grateful?
I mean, these are all hard questions, aren't they? I chose that. I mean, undoubtedly for having people around me who love me, and family, my wife, my children, My parents, both gone now, but they did, absolutely, brothers and sisters, and lots of friends as well. And I just think it's an extraordinary thing to have people who love you and who accept you for what you are. Not everybody has that, I know.
Sure.
And I know people who haven't had that either in their childhood or at various points in their lives. And I haven't also at various points in my life. And I just think it's such a wonderful thing, and I'm every day grateful for that. So that was my thing.
I think that's really nice, isn't it? And I think you picked up on something then, that often the absence of something makes the presence of something even more valuable.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess time is another key thing, isn't it, for all people, it seems seemingly in education. I've been thinking more about that recently, about how I use my time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that later in life I will be angry about how little time is left and whether I used what I had as useful as possible.
Well, I think I've always thought you have to live your life in a way that you're not going to have regrets. And mostly people don't regret, if you make a way up a decision and you choose to do something and then with hindsight it turns out to be wrong, I don't think you should regret that if you made the best decision you could at that moment. Hindsight is, you didn't have it at the time.
Sure.
So it's unfair to beat yourself up for saying, well, that turned out to be wrong.
Yeah.
So you make the best decision you could, and you can't blame yourself. You can't regret that, really, because you didn't know what was going to happen. And but what you can regret is, I had that opportunity and I knew at the time I should have done it and I didn't. So those kinds of things, So don't do that. I agree. I think
that's useful.
How you spend your time is a choice, and you do have to decide. Not just have it by default. Well, work's really busy, so I have to do that. No, you don't. You can choose.
You can make a choice. Yeah, that's powerful. And it links a little bit, I suppose, to what we were talking about then about, if you've got receipt of feedback and you don't act on it, that's probably not as smart as not having any feedback, because you do know then, don't you? Yeah, interesting.
It is, but actually it's not automatic, and that's one of the really interesting things about feedback. And I don't want to jump ahead because this is one of the launch pads is about feedback, really. And I think the challenge isn't so much, we talked about, say, the student feedback tool that you've used and that we've developed at EBE. Most people, if they're brave enough to do it, they can look at the feedback, they can understand it, they can take something from it that is quite a sensible change to make. But what's relatively rare is for them to then actually make that change. So, they're good, they're well-intentioned, they want to do this thing, they know that it's a good thing to do. They're quite often perfectly capable of doing it. It's not so much about, becoming a concert pianist or a grandmaster at chess.
Yeah, sure.
They have the capability to do it. It's a relatively simple thing that they could just do. And yet they're not able to make those changes in a way that becomes sustained and routine and automatic. And so habit change is hard, and changing behaviour is hard. And, feedback, acting on feedback is sometimes a bit about that. Same with students, actually. We give them lots of feedback, even assuming they recognise it's feedback, which they don't always, even assuming that they know what to do with it, which they don't always. But, even given those two things, then do they actually do what the feedback tells them to? Well, again, quite often not.
No.
Because that's the nature of complex tasks and human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to this next bit then, because what we're really interested in, I guess, in this podcast, and why it's slightly different to, I guess, a standard format, is this idea of getting behind some of the things that leaders have experienced that have made a difference. And so this idea of an ignition point is, Rob's chosen some events or things that have happened to him in his life that have transformed him in some way. And so this first one, Rob, tell us a bit about what was life like before it, what was the ignition point, and then how was it different afterwards?
Okay, I think the first one is about basically deciding to leave teaching and go and do a PhD.
Right.
And I'd been teaching for about 7 or 8 years, I think. I was a second in department. I was thinking kind of, well, do I want to go for the next thing? I was a secondary maths teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't really sure. And I certainly didn't want to be a head or a deputy head or any of that kind of stuff. I was pretty sure that wasn't for me. So I was kind of thinking, right, well, what do I do next? And I'd done a master's previously in education, maths education, and really quite enjoyed that. It felt quite an interesting thing to do. So I was thinking, right, well, what about maybe doing a PhD then? And so I started looking around, and I got in touch with a person who I didn't know at all, called Carol Fitzgibbon, who was a professor, well, actually then at Newcastle University.
Right.
And I mean, I kind of knew of her a bit because this is in the mid-90s. And I imagine most of the listeners to this podcast were, some of them not even born in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
Certainly mostly won't really remember that time unless
Sure.
they're quite old like me. But she was like, I suppose, kind of, quite a well-known, as professors of education go, she was well-known. She used to write in the TES, or Times Education Supplement, as it was called then. So she had a bit of a public profile, I guess. So I did know her a bit through that. And she was really, really funny, interesting, engaging sort of person, quite a dynamic person. Right. She described herself as a granny from Oldham.
Oh, hilarious.
And, she was a granny and she was from Oldham, but that didn't really capture all that she had.
Yeah.
Very modest as well. Anyway, I asked to meet her and went up to Newcastle and met with her and chatted about this thing. And she was just so enthusiastic and so encouraging and so, yeah, you can do this thing. And I ended up applying to do it and ended up doing it with her. And, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. And she was just so supportive that that made it feel like an easy choice, I think, and something that I was confident about doing.
Nice. And that's really interesting, because that does seem to be a bit of a theme that's coming through in a lot of the podcasts, is that it was the presence of another person that supported the transformation, and it's usually a supportive presence. I guess linking it back to leadership, I sometimes wonder whether leaders forget that powerful position they're in, and potentially being the person that unlocks or provides stimulus to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think teachers do that actually as well with students. I think often we don't know how we've influenced a child's life or a young person's life. Sometimes they do tell us. Sometimes we maintain some kind of relationship with them or hear from them later. Yeah. That happened a handful of times to me, where people have come back to me a few years after and said, thanks for everything you did, and here's what I'm doing now. And it always feels like a surprise that you think, well, did I really, do anything? But clearly in their heads you did, and you really made a difference. And at the time you certainly didn't know that. No. So I think that's a really it's one of the reasons why teaching is such a great job, because you do make a difference to people's lives, and there's nothing more fulfilling, there's nothing more satisfying, there's nothing really more pleasurable actually than helping somebody else. Yeah.
Well, I've got I don't know if it'll be funny or it'll be awkward or what, coming up soon actually, because I've got what my son would call a proper book coming out in July around self-efficacy, which is what the doctorate was in. Of course, the other one a picture book, but and interestingly, the testimonial is to a single teacher called Mr. Money, who was the head of post 16 at my school. Okay, who was the first person to push me beyond my comfort zone. Right. And effectively changed my whole life. And I don't think he knows he did that. Oh, really? He definitely doesn't know that I've dedicated the book to him. Wow. But he still lives in Bristol, and so my plan is to literally go and give him a copy of this book. And I think I'm going to be a bit emotional at that point. And I wonder how
Yes.
he's going to react to it.
I can imagine. Yeah. Perhaps he's listening to this podcast.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, my family are quite upset that they're not in the testimonial, but I tried to suggest that, yeah, I mean, they're a post that. Anyway, it's not about me today, is it?
Okay, well,
let's
that's
talk a bit about your first launchpad, because this is an area that I've only really dipped my toe into, so I'd be fascinated to hear a bit more from you, really, in this idea of kind of theories of change, or a theory of change, or a person's theory of change. And so if I go through this, I'll explain a little bit about where my thinking was and what what I did when I came up with the, and then you can fill in the gaps, I guess. But for me, it was really interesting, this idea that, intervention's tough, and it's rarely done as well as people would like, sadly. But having this idea, having a robust theory of change, which is a personal thing, as we'll find out, can make it more successful. And I mean, my limited understanding of this was, for those who haven't even dipped their toe into it, this idea that a theory of change is not. The shift for me was thinking, oh, it's Cotter, oh, it's Lewin's theory of change, and it wasn't that. It was this idea of a kind of comprehensive description or illustration of how a personal desired change might happen, and that was typically in a paragraph, but also, again, it leaned into me this idea of a visual diagram. But I was fascinated by its kind of power, a bit like a lesson plan almost, in that the power of it is in the process of creating it, rather than the actual product that comes out the other side. But for those that are listening, some of the benefits I tripped over were this idea of, it allows you to locate the different stages involved in change. It pushes you to ensure that those kind of elements fit together logically and flow in the right order. The process of creating it, highlights potential roadblocks. It allows you to anticipate where you might need support, but also key milestones. And again, my limited involvement, looked at this idea of, okay, putting in the different steps. So what are the different outcomes, or A plus B equals C, and those sorts of things were the first step. And then thinking more about, okay, well, how will I get from A to B? What interventions or what activities or kind of things will go and allow me to make those steps? And then into this idea of, and for me, this was, again, coming back to that idea of uncomfortability, being uncomfortable. What assumptions have I made about using that activity to get from A to B? And when I do training on this, one of the ones that comes up a lot is as simple as, I don't know, we want greater parental engagement, so we're going to create a parental newsletter. Okay. Well, the assumptions are pretty like, A, it'll get home, B, they'll read it, C, they'll understand it, D, they'll care about, and all those sorts of things, which I think are really interesting.
Exactly.
And then I guess I then lent into this idea that once you've identified the assumptions, can you think of a response that would mitigate or help support that? But tell us a bit more about why it resonated with you.
Well, all of that, and I think it maybe just because of some of the work that I've been doing in terms of thinking about how we as an organisation at Evidence-Based Education, how do we, we're interested in doing things that help teachers and school leaders to make changes that help children and young people to learn more. So that's what we're about. But that's, everyone could sign up to that. That's not distinctive at all. It doesn't really tell you much about how we're going to do it. And it's those middle steps in the way and thinking about that. And I suppose thinking a lot about, when often people think about professional development type interventions, and I think they often don't think enough about classroom practice. How is this going to change what's happening in classrooms? So, let's think of an example. So supposing you're a school leader and you're thinking about how we do professional development, and you're thinking about your inset days. Let's say you have the 5 classic inset days at start of term or whatever, where everyone gets together in the hall, they listen to, you invite a speaker in, they talk about something or other, and then you think everyone's going to go off and do that thing. Or, well, exactly what do you think? That's the thing. What's the theory of change? So how does sitting in a room listening to a speaker for an hour, what comes out of that? Do people know more as a result? Okay. If they do know more, do they then think differently? If they think differently, do they act differently? If they act differently, in what kinds of ways? And the thing is that you're right, these are assumptions. We're assuming that if I do a talk about assessment for learning, let's say, or something like that to a school, a group of teachers, that they then understand more about assessment for learning. Okay, well, that might be true. Might depend how good my talk is and so on. But it's the kind of thing we can test. Let's find out if that is actually true. So, or your example with the newsletter, can we find out how many of them do actually make it home or get to be seen by parents? Is there some way we could investigate that and learn? If they are seen by parents, do the parents read them? Do they understand them? Well, can we test that? We could see, And these things are not easy to test, but they are possible to test. And the key thing is, if you don't know whether you're getting through step A, step B, step C, unless you're getting through those steps, then there's no chance that it's going to work. If the parent doesn't even see it, they won't even know it's happened. So that's dead in the water. And so you have to, these are crucial steps. So not to know whether you've succeeded with those steps is like saying, well, I don't really know, and I don't care whether this works or not because I've got no way of knowing. Yeah. And so in the context of trying to do things that make a difference, or in the context of evaluation in particular, and we're always trying to evaluate as we go, formatively evaluate everything we do so we can learn how to make it better. And that also is true of school leaders, I think, or should be, trying to evaluate the whole time. So thinking out what those steps are in between, that's basically what theory of change is for me. It's a series of logical, if I do this, then, if I create a newsletter and I hand it out in tutor time, then the parents will see it. If the parents see it, they'll engage with it. If they engage with it, they'll understand better, and we'll strengthen the relationship and the community builds, So if this, then that, and then each of those you have to test. And, you've put your finger on it exactly about trying to identify those assumptions, and I think then trying to test them. The problem with assumptions is we can't ever really see our own assumptions. No. It's like a fish not knowing that it's swimming in water because everything is water. We're surrounded by them. We can't see them ourselves, like cognitive biases and so on. Yeah. So how do we tease that out? How do we work out what our assumptions are? And there are techniques for doing it, but it is bottom line, it's pretty hard to do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fascinating. And the bit that I think you've added there to my thinking is this idea that you can't neglect the testing element of it. You've got to find out, and that's, one of the things that I'm regularly surprised by when I work with leaders of professional development, and I ask them, how's the professional development landing in the classroom? And they say, what do you mean? And I say, well, you did a session on assessment for learning last week. Are people doing it? And they say, I don't know.
Well, then it hasn't worked. I think the default assumption should always be that if you don't have evidence that it's had impact, then assume it hasn't.
It hasn't. Yeah.
And you might say, well, that's a bit of a negative, glass half empty way of looking at the world. But I think that's a more rigorous, critical way of saying, well, the burden of proof should be on the person, and the steps in between them changing classroom practice. So unpick that about. What about the learning? The person who's engaged with that input, whatever that is, that's some training of some kind. Have they actually understood the ideas? Are they thinking differently? Yeah. And if you subject that to any kind of scrutiny, you'll realise it's pretty implausible, because what do we know about learning? We know it's hard. We know it doesn't happen from one-offs. We certainly wouldn't try and teach our students about, I don't know, covalent bonding or something. We've just put them all in a room together in the hall, tell them about it once and say, off you go. You know how to do this now. No teacher would think, well, of course they won't know how to do it. And even if they did, a week later, they won't remember. So we haven't taught them covalent, whatever it is. So why do we think that's going to work for grown-ups? And we just shouldn't. Right. But it's just because that's what we've typically done.
Yeah. And, I mean, just to jump back to the idea of, potentially assuming it, that negative side of things, it's probably more dangerous to assume it has and to err on the side of positivity all the time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's a bit like, so one of your other ones is the pre-mortem. I think I wasn't allowed to pick that because someone else had already
someone else has snatched it up.
But, that's a really good one. And because the mindset is that let's assume this hasn't worked, why not?
Yeah.
Let's assume it's not going to work, why might it not? Yeah. Let's test that out. Let's demonstrate. Let's find evidence whether it has or not. And if it has, great, we move on to the next step. If it hasn't, right, well, we need to fix that, because if we haven't got even through that, if we haven't even achieved the learning in people's heads, then of course we can't expect that it's going to change their behaviour.
No. Exactly. All right, this is great. Well, let's keep going on this then. So, Rob's next Fast Friends question was this. If he had a crystal ball, so if you had a crystal ball that could tell you the truth about yourself, your life, the future, or anything else, what would you want to know? Wow.
Yeah, this is I think I picked this because you offered a selection of questions, and I didn't really like any of the other ones for some reason. I can't remember what they were. But so it's maybe a bit of a cop-out, but my honest answer is nothing, actually. Right. I honestly don't think there's anything. I think, the richness of life for me is all about not knowing what's happening.
Nice.
Obviously, having a certain amount of order and control and things not being terrible. And I know if your experience hasn't been that, then maybe you'd want to know.
Yeah.
So that maybe just reflects the luxury of my happy life. But I honestly don't think I would want to know. I think I literally can't think of anything. I want to live my life in real time.
Yeah. Well, also there's a joy in discovery.
Exactly.
In there.
Yeah.
That's the Yeah, I love that. Okay, well that's pushing on there. No, that's good. So in terms of the second ignition point then, tell us a bit about this, what was life like before, what was the ignition point, and afterwards?
Okay, so this is the leaving Durham University and going to work at EBE, and I've already just mentioned this a bit already actually on this chat. I'd been at the university, I'd been an academic at the university, I was professor of education, I'd been there 20 years. It was good. I enjoyed being an academic, and I would, I wouldn't say I'd never do it again. It could happen. But, things had gone a little bit sour, I guess, in terms of where I was there. I was ready for a change. This opportunity came along, and it seemed to be that I could still do the kind of research that I was interested in. And I think that is still true. I'd still describe myself as a researcher, I'm director of research and development. I spend a lot of my time analysing data sets and writing papers and doing stuff like, going to conferences, the things that researchers do, and chatting with other researchers, all of that. I still do those things, but I'm also much more able to create products, create tools, create supports and training and structures that help people, that translate those ideas from research into something that hopefully helps people, but also to then evaluate that, to learn whether it is helping. So everything that we're doing is about trying stuff out, learning whether it's, thinking through this theory of change about, okay, here's what we have to do. We have to get people to engage with the platform. We have to get them to use the tools like the student surveys and the video and so on. And most teachers are not using about 1 in 10 who have an account actually do a student survey. Right. So we've got 9 in 10 who have access to it. In fact, everyone has access. You can create a free account and just do a survey. So lots of people are not choosing to do it. So obviously, it's not going to help them if they don't choose to do it, and there are probably good reasons why they don't want to choose to do it. If we could just nudge that from, let's say, 10% to 15%, well, that's moving it in the right direction, and so that's like the first challenge. And that's not, there isn't research. Well, there is research about things like nudges and behavioural science and things. How do you get people to change those kinds of behaviours? So we can draw on that, but it's not education research, and it's not we know it's cognitive load theory, or we know it's formative assessment, or whatever it might be. It's just about, well, how do we get people to engage with the platform? So it's more like a kind of marketing challenge than it is really a pedagogical challenge, if you like. But it's an interesting challenge, and it's important because if you don't achieve that, then you're not going to get to the next stage, which is that they get useful insights from that student survey, and then they might get those insights. They might be able to plan a goal that they, a specific change that they want to make. But if they then don't make that change, again, it's not going to have benefit for their students. So we need to help them with that as well. So the whole thing is about structuring, translating that research idea, which is that giving people feedback can really help them, into something that actually delivers that. And of course, it's really complex, but it was just going to be. I tried to do that a few times with different things while I was at the university, and succeeded a bit, I think, but it was always a bit of an uphill challenge because the organisation is not really set up to do those kinds of things. So you're always a bit of an outlier. You're always slightly swimming against the tide. Whereas an organisation like EBE, well, that's exactly what we're doing. It's a commercial organisation, but it is absolutely grounded in research thinking, research activity.
Well, I'll speak for everybody. I'm glad that you left Durham and went to EBE, because I'm not sure I would have tripped over your stuff if not. So thanks to that ignition point for sure. In terms of the second launchpad, we talked about this idea of kind of feedback, and I guess for leaders, something they may have engaged with in the past is this idea of a 360 assessment. For some people it's been positive, for some people negative, and sadly I think that sits in the kind of the way that they're done. And when I was kind of looking at this, this is what jumped out in my mind, in that I think I'm guilty in the past of designing these things with the wrong things in mind, probably designing them at a scale and trying to make them simple and trying to make them efficient, and then potentially damaging the information. So for people that are again new to this idea, the rationale is pretty strong, I suppose, in that self-assessment data is questionable when it's used in isolation. So the idea is that you gain additional viewpoints, which then strengthen, hopefully, the validity. But lots of barriers to these things, and again, stuff to unpick. This idea that there's lots of cognitive and personal biases involved in rating other people's performance. There's something around social desirability biases, and making sure that people are being honest. There's something about understanding the scale and the questions. If you don't understand, then potentially there's weaknesses in your responses. Whether it's relevant, there's a danger in creating kind of vanilla flavored, generic questionnaires. Something about engagement. Do people take 2 minutes? Do people take 30 minutes? How much effort do they put in? And then do you judge their responses equally? Something about picking the right people. And then when you design it, do you go for breadth or depth? Do you oversimplify things? And then there's something about the person on the other end. Do they accept? The credibility of the feedback. Are they safe enough to admit, wow, that is a problem? And then do they understand where it's coming from? And so things I was playing around with was this idea that, as I said before, slightly lazily, I've always just used the same assessment method for the person being assessed and the assessors. Potentially, could we widen that to involve the things like interview? do the questions need to be the same? Again, the simple thing is to send the same questionnaire out to everybody, but there was something I tripped over about, that we're only really able to accurately assess our own perceptions rather than our perceptions of other things, which was interesting. And then this idea of kind of what pre and post work could we do with people that would improve that. So tell me a bit about your kind of, why this resonates with you.
Yeah, well, I think all of that's right. This is one of those things that has the potential to be really powerful. It can be really powerful. Again, it's just giving you an insight into your own practice if you're the subject of this, from multiple viewpoints, and that can be really helpful. It suffers the same kinds of problems that we've talked about already of understanding, getting meaningful feedback, understanding that feedback, but then particularly acting on it.
Yeah.
And I've had experiences when I was director of the CEM at Durham. I was did this, and other people in the senior leadership team also did it. And it's a kind of a bracing thing to do. Not everybody is always massively positive about everything. You hear some things that may be a bit challenging to hear. But it felt like it was a worthwhile process. And when you look at the research on it, actually, it's not that convincing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's not clear that it leads to overall beneficial permanent change, actually, in many cases. So why is that? And, that's an interesting thing. But I think it has the potential to be really powerful. I do think one of the things that we invest, the kind of lazy approach, is to just trust your own self-assessment, because I'm doing the job, I'm evaluating myself the whole time. I know whether I'm doing it well, and that applies to people in leadership roles. It applies to classroom teachers as well. And if you look at all the evidence about self-assessment, it's absolutely terrible. It bears almost no relation to other measures of performance, either more objective measures or other people's perceptions. Very, very low correlations typically. So self-assessment is mostly wrong.
Yeah.
And it's also mostly over-optimistic. So we tend to rate ourselves more positively than, other measures, objective or other people's ratings. So we have this kind of slightly deluded, slightly rose-tinted view of our own contribution to the world, just because that's how human beings operate. Yeah. But that's not very helpful for helping us to be better. No. That's helpful for feeling quite sort of smug and satisfied, and our egos being intact, but it doesn't really help us to improve what we're doing. So if we have this improvement mindset, we want to get beyond that. We don't just want to be self-satisfied and smug and thinking, I'm doing all right, thanks. We want to be thinking, right, well, yes, I'm doing all right, thanks, but what could I do that's even better? And so getting that kind of feedback from peers, from reports, from bosses or whatever, in that 360 approach, I think can be very, very powerful. Mm-hmm. And but as you say, depends how you do it. Yeah. And you've got to make it kind of slick and efficient, not make it too much of a burdensome thing, but make sure there's enough information in there, enough insight, and that it's trustworthy to give you the information you need. And then I think crucially, you have to support the follow-up actions. So people can, I think, typically, mostly identify sensible changes that they know they should make in their practice as a result of doing an exercise like this. But making those changes and embedding them, becoming permanent and routine, is actually very hard, and almost everybody needs help with that. So we need to think about how do we help people to really make those changes.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of your time. So in terms of the last question you chose, what personal quality do you feel you need to develop the most? Oh, tell us about
that. Well, there's always lots of things. I think just being a bit more sociable or engaging with people a bit more. my happy place at work is really just to be on my own with the data set, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And wrestling with or learning a new technique, as I say,
Yeah.
like I was yesterday. But it's really important. I work as part of a team. I do work as part of a team. It's an important part of how we operate. It makes a lot of difference to be part of a team, to engage with people. And to do that, I find I have to make a bit of an effort. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to me.
Yeah.
Just to be interested in people, just to have those low level or not nothing really depends on them too much. Conversations about how was your holiday in Italy or that kind of thing. That none of that really comes naturally to me. I'm a sort of shy introvert, I suppose. So I make an effort, and I could make more effort. I think I could do that better.
Nice. Well, again, all there's left to say really is just thanks, Rob. I mean, again, I said at the very beginning, it's a kind of a pinch me moment that you were even here, and as we usually joke, you've been an uncomfortable but useful part of my professional journey.
That's good.
If people haven't engaged with evidence-based education, then definitely do that, and obviously engage with Rob on the socials. If you've enjoyed this, then check out the book, connect with me on socials, and we'll catch you at the next one.
Well,
Thanks for listening.
Chris. It's been fun, and
Amazing.
good luck with the podcast.
Thanks very much.